Good morning. Welcome. On behalf of the Institute for Global Studies at the University of Minnesota, I'd like to welcome you to Genocide and Its Aftermaths, Lessons from Rwanda. I'm Evelyn David Heiser. I direct the Institute for Global Studies, and today's conference is the first in a series of events entitled The Oanesian Dialogues on Mass Atrocities and Their Aftermaths. These dialogues have been generously funded by the Oanesian Endowment Fund for Justice and Peace Studies of the Minneapolis Foundation. And I will say more about our sponsor in just a moment. I'm kind of being blinded by that spotlight. Thank you. As you all know, this month marks 20 years since the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. In just a few short months, more than 1 million people were killed. And although extremists in the Rwandan government planned the genocide, almost 1 million citizens also participated in this violence in some way, ranging from looting their neighbors' homes to raping and killing victims. The unspeakable horror of those events and the failure of the international community to respond have provoked ongoing efforts to grapple with the legacy of the genocide. 10 years ago, we held a conference marking a decade since these events and focusing on issues of trauma and healing. At that point, we made little effort to address the lessons from Rwanda. 10 years further on, we have decided to redress that omission, not because the lessons are clear, but precisely because they remain contested. This conference brings together scholars, policymakers, and practitioners from around the world to reflect on the genocide and lessons that can be learned. We aim to better understand the unique challenges that Rwanda faced after the genocide, including dealing with contested narratives and memories, judicial responses to the violence, repairing societal relations, and promoting development and gender equality. In sorting through the lessons from Rwanda and debating these lessons, we are responding to Arsham Oanesian's deep concern that genocide be prevented. Arsham Oanesian was an Armenian born in Iraq. His family members were victims of the 1914 genocide perpetrated by Turkey. He came to the United States in 1952 and was a tireless advocate for human rights and peace. In 2001, Oanesian made a generous gift to endow the Arsham and Charlotte Oanesian Chair in the College of Liberal Arts. Last night, those of you at dinner heard from Ana Forcinito in our Department of Spanish and Portuguese, who currently holds that chair. Through the gift of the chair, Arsham articulated his vision of a world in which mass slaughter is but a distant memory and human communities, however different they may be, work together for the common good. His gift also testified to his belief in the power of education to create such a world. This week's conference is a further demonstration of Arsham Oanesian's vision. Our sponsor, again, the Oanesian Endowment Fund for Justice and Peace Studies of the Minneapolis Foundation, promotes scholarship and dialogue aimed at bridging ethnic, national, racial, and religious differences throughout the world. Through conferences, films, and community events, the endowment is an expression of the values that Oanesian held dear. He hoped the activities supported by the endowment would help heal wounds inflicted by genocides that have already occurred and diffuse the hatreds that might fuel future genocides. This was his life's great passion. On behalf of the University of Minnesota and the Institute for Global Studies, I want to express my thanks to the Minneapolis Foundation for their assistance in making this conference possible. Today's conference is the first of 3 days of activities. You have the program for today's events that run all day through the keynote this evening, and I hope that you can stay for all of it. We will have people coming in and out as time goes on. Tomorrow, we have a student research conference. We have students coming not just from the Twin Cities area and from our own campus, but from other parts of the country and from around the world. There's a list of the panels and papers that the students are presenting tomorrow. That will be in Kaufman Union. On Saturday, we are holding a workshop for educators, and I wanted to highlight that so that you have a sense of the breadth of the activities around this conference. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the teacher workshop is completely full, which is just phenomenal. We have 45, Deborah? That's great. And I think there were more who would have signed up if there had been space. So we're really responding to a need in the community. Now the thank yous. Obviously, an extensive set of activities like this takes a really strong team, and I'd like to thank the co-organizers of the event, Barb Fry and the Human Rights Program, Alejandro Baer and the Center for Genocide and Holocaust Studies, Dean Eric Schwartz and the Humphrey Institute. There's also a long list of co-sponsors on the back of your program. I'm not going to read those, but I wanted to point that list out to show the breadth of engagement in this project. I'd also like to thank the team that really put this together and made it possible, particularly Kayla McKinnon, who I think all of you have met and interacted with. There she is in the back. She's done a phenomenal job. Wahutu Siguru, a graduate student in the sociology department, our events team, Emily Janish and Rachel Wolf, Holly Neiseth Brem, and Deborah Jane, our outreach coordinator. Thank you all for all of the work that you've done to make this possible. A couple housekeeping details. Make sure your cell phones are in silent mode, please. And we are taping this so that it will be available more broadly. So if you ask a question, I think we're doing questions by note cards, if I'm not mistaken, but just so that you know, you may be captured on videotape if you stand up, and we assume that entering the auditorium, you're giving your permission for that. So we're live streaming as well. Some of our partner institutions asked if we could do that. So this is being streamed live on the web. So that's the end of the preliminaries. I wanted to call Holly Neiseth Brem up to start things. Holly is a sociology PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota. Her dissertation examines the factors that influence the onset of genocidal violence globally, as well as regional and temporal variation within genocidal violence in Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Sudan, Darfur. Holly lived in Rwanda for several months in 2012, conducting dissertation research and interning with the Rwandan National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide. She recently returned to Rwanda and is back just within the last week or so, where once again she worked with the commission. Her work on genocide will be featured as part of the upcoming Pacific Standards 30 Top Thinkers under the age of 30. And Holly is currently serving as the chair of the board of directors of the Heritage Academy of Science and Technology, as well as a quantitative mentor for the Center for Victims of Torture, and as the graduate editor of the Society Pages. In the fall, she will join the faculty of Ohio State University. So not just someone with interest in this area, but one of the success stories of our graduate programs. So Holly, why don't you come up here?
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be able to introduce our morning keynote speaker, Taylor Krauss. Mr. Krauss is a graduate of Yale University and an independent video journalist. An Emmy Award nominee for Best Producer, Mr. Krauss has worked on numerous films about human rights, covering very important topics such as refugees, human trafficking, and genocide. Today, Mr. Krauss will be speaking about a project he directs called Voices of Rwanda. This amazing project, which he founded, is Rwanda's first video archive established to film the testimonies of the survivors of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Voices of Rwanda is dedicated to recording and preserving these testimonies and to ensuring that they inform the world about genocide and inspire a global sense of responsibility to prevent atrocities. This morning, Mr. Krauss will be sharing some of those testimonies with us. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Taylor Krauss.
Good morning. Mwaramutse. Okay, here you go. It's nice to hear that there are many in here who have been to Rwanda. Perhaps it's self-evident to all of us here today that while very few of us were directly affected by the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, many of us have felt our lives forever affected, albeit indirectly, for having chosen to study and work in Rwanda because of the genocide. In other words, a confrontation with this history by choice has left an indelible imprint, and many of us find ourselves somewhere between the spectrum of tourist to secondary witness, but none without having personally and emotionally been affected, which must be an unusual phenomenon when it comes to most academic conferences. Genocide is something I consider something like a black hole. It embodies its own gravity, pulling everyone who has come into contact with it ever deeper, informing and distorting the very way one sees light in the world forever after. No doubt, I am not alone in suggesting that those of us who work on Rwanda, with a particular focus on the genocide, confront our own thoughts and emotions and emotional responses to the gravity of these events on a regular basis, if not daily. And yet we rarely have an opportunity to do so in community, nor in the company of those who also spend their days and their nights ruminating over Rwanda. In this way, commemorating here together is an opportunity to reconcile the very personal with the communal. I'm thankful to the organizing committee, Holly and Kayla, Wahutu, Rachel, Deborah, Evelyn, Barbara, Alejandro, Eric, all those involved in this conference for bringing us here together to share our thoughts about what we in the international community are learning or not about ourselves, our institutions, and the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. When I first visited Kigali 10 years ago, I was struck then, as I continue to be, by the challenges the many rescapés, those who escaped physical death, face on a daily basis. Whether an elderly widow living in the countryside next to the killer of her own family, to the young rescapée who must raise her siblings as if they were her own children, the challenges of the rescapés are beyond what I ever could have imagined. And I'm not even speaking about those who live with physical deformity or unmanageable trauma. I came to learn through testimony how genocide persisted in the lives of the rescapés, not just on account of the absence of family, friends, and loved ones, but also by the presence of the genocidaires who, living as neighbors in their midst, were reminders of the past, just as churches and marshes and rains and songs also become daily reminders of painful remembrances. It was clear to me then, as it is today, that for the rescapés, the genocide persists, no matter how much time has passed. That the genocide did not just take place over the course of 3 months in 1994, but that it is ongoing. It has been said that the final stage of genocide is the elimination of the trace, the denial of the evidence, the erasure of the history. In this denial and elimination of the history, a genocide becomes complete. As such, once any genocide begins, it continues in perpetuity until it is made complete, until the history is erased and forgotten. In this vein, if we allow in the international community which failed Rwanda in 1994, to allow this history to be erased and denied and forgotten, we become further complicit in it by allowing it to become complete. This is perhaps one of the essential reasons to take part in commemoration, to revive the evidence, to take part in the push against the inexorable erasure. Testimony is an act which pushes against this erasure by first establishing history during the filming and then transmitting it over and over every time it is heard. Testimony is not so much a record of the past, but rather a record of someone recounting the past. And it makes those of us who watch it secondary witnesses to those who are living with the past. Since 2006, I've been filming testimonies of the rescapés for use in education, research, and memorialization. I'd like to share a few excerpts from testimonies in order to bring Ancila, Josephine, and Vincent, 3 of the rescapés who live with the presence of the past, into this conversation today, so that we may be reminded throughout the day of what aftermath really means.
Niho nyine aho nari narashatse niyo ntambara yatangiye kwica nyine nibwo bakinagizaga abantu babaroha muri Nyabarongo niho batangiye ubwo bararohaga mu ruzi abandi bakashyira mu mingoti nanjye bashyizemo icyo gihe bivamo ubwo kugira ngo iyo ntambara yanze kuyirokoka twahungiye ku kiliziya kera icyo gihe bahongeraga ku kiliziya yarakiraga ubwo byageze aho barunamura mbese barica abashakiye bararikira maze kuva muri Nyabarongo icyo gihe ndagenda aho nari nihishe ndumva nari ndi mu gifunzo ndohotse nyine icyo gihe baducishaga mu ruzi hasi baturoheraga haruguru yarwo umuntu akarugendamo ubwo icyo gihe ninjye wavuyemo njyenyine abandi bose ibyo ndohokera ahantu mbese mu gifunzo icyo gifunzo maze kukiruhukamo ariko si ukuvuga nagize ubushobozi n'Imana yankuyemo sinzi koga nagiyemo aho uzashakira ndegama umucanga aho negama ahubwo ubwo namaze kuvamo numva afite ubwoba nkajya numva barimo kuba aho nzaviramo nza kugenda hari ahantu nagiye ngo ngiye nabaye mu gifunzo bigeze aho ndavuga nti iki gifunzo nanone nabuze ikindya nta bikoko byabaga ubwo ntibamo bigeze aho ndareba se nzaba mu bigenda bite meze ndiko nari nararangirize rwose bamuha amasakaramentu yanyu n'ubu najyaga ndi ku mucanga kubera byo nagiye mera by'amazi icyo gihe mbese aho ngeze bongeye kumvumbura nanone baranshorera nanone barongera barankubita bavuga bati burya azi koga noneho ubwo avuyemo ni ukugenda tukamutema igipande kimwe kikagiriye ikindi kikagiriye kuko nazaba ari hamwe azongera aterana ariko icyo gihe Imana yarabandinze nanone ubwo naje kugira nyine Imana irabankiza sinzi icyo gihe ikintu cy'intuza cy'isaso bumvise abari banshoreye nanone bankuye ahantu mu nzu nari nihishe noneho ubwo bumvise ikintu cy'igisasu sinzi aho cyaturikiye baranyanyagira nsigara buri nyuma yaho icyo gihe abashoboye kurokoka twari kugiye ku kiliziya hari aho twageze kuri komine bashaka kutwikira mu ntuza mu biro bya iga sinzi uwabimenye avuga ati hari ahantu barimo kudushyira tubagiye kutwica tubagiye kudutwikiramo akatubwira ngo nimujyemo mwese mujyemo aho tubimenyeye twese ati musohoke bagiye kutwica turasohoka rero nyuma yaho twaje gukomeza turashorerana tugera ku kiliziya iyo turayirokoka ariko iyo bintuza y'ejo bundi rero nyirahiziye n'ibyo. Mbese aya mazina uko muyabona ni ay'abana banjye. Muri aba bana bose uko barora umwana nihambiye n'uyu wo hejuru w'imfura yanjye, aba bose barishwe. Reba bose ni abakirisitu. Uwa mbere yitwa Nshimiyimana Vedasiti, uwa kabiri yitwa Viatori Hakizimana, uwa gatatu yitwa Mugwaneza Maria Chantal, uwa kangahe nanone yitwa Gororiyozi, uwa gatanu Murekatete, uko bakurikiranye undi yitwa Vigitori Hakuzimana, undi yitwa Havugimana Vise. Abo bose ni abakirisitu narabatirishije. Uko bameze gutya abo bose barapfuye. Se wabo muramubona hepfo ye yabo yitwa Gasangano Jean Marie Vianney. Ubwo nararangije ndavuga ngo Imana ibahiruko ridashira kuko ntazongera guhura nabo. Ubu rero ngiye kubigira gutya nashatse kugira ngo ntazibagirwa amazina yabo, ngiye nkora mbibuka iteka, kuko n'ubu urumva untunga ukambaza amazina sinayibuka, ariko nkumva amazina y'abana banjye agomba guhora ku mutima wanjye. Mu gitondo ku itariki ya 9 haza umugabo witwa Bonaheka Stanislas. N'ubu njye nibaza impamvu ntajya numva bamushakisha mu bantu bashakisha, kuko niwe haba umuntu wakoze ibintu bikomeye cyane nawe arimo. Araje abwiye ba padiri ati aba bantu mwaretse bagataha bagasubira mu mago yabo bakarindirwa mu ngo zabo. Padiri wari uhari wari recteur w'iseminari amwita se turabwira abantu bataha icyo bahunze kitarangiye ko baduhungiyeho kandi ntacyo babaye hano mwaretse bakaguma hano. Ati ndavuze ngo batahe. Ubwo abagabo babaga babyumva natwe turi aho ngaho turimo gukora amasuku twaraye. Noneho Padiri arambwira ntabwo rwose ushaka gutaha arataha, ariko ntabwo tubwira abantu ngo batahe, ntabwo twabishobora, uso turabwira ndetse tureke ndi. Noneho mbona bekajya kuzana abasirikare kuri 11 mu gitondo saa 3. Tega basaga n'ababanje kuruhuka nyine ijoro ryose babaga bari bakoze bitangaza nuko baraza benshi cyane bambaye ibitambaro bambaye amakoma bafite imbere. Baraza basanga aho twari turi ati nimuzane amafaranga mufite. Nta mafaranga dufite. Muzane amafaranga mufite kandi uwo dusangana n'igiciro atakiduhaye turamwica. Abari bafite ubwo baratanze twebwe nta n'igiceri cy'icumi twari dusigaranye. Haza umugore umwe yiyanditse muri amakoma niwe wahagurukije abana banjye b'abakobwa, bari kumwe n'abandi bagabo bahita bahagurutsa na papa w'abana n'undi mugabo umwe barabasohora babajyana hanze bavuga ngo bagiye kubica. Babagejeje hanze wa mugore akuramo abana banjye imyenda bari bambaye ibipantaro arabibambura ahita abyambara. Noneho
turasohoka baradusohora ntawe dukoraho mwese hasi mujyanye. Hari umugabo witwa Mutsinzi yari yitwikiriye kuvuriro bari bamuhaye, aratumbuka ariruka yirutse niwe bamurasa amaguru. Ibindi ntumbaze ko byagenze, twararyamye cyangwa kukiho no kwica, bicisha imihoro, bicisha udushoka, bicisha impiri. Ikintu nibuka cyo gukora umuhoro wa mbere njye narawumvise, kuko baranwumvise nsa n'uzamutse ngiye kurwana nabo, basubizamo undi ntabwo nawumvise, ngo byahise birangira nyine. Byageze ubwo hari nko mu masaa 3 nibwo simbizi. Mpagarara aho muri imirambo, ndahagarara numva ijwi rirambwira ngo komera tugende. Numva ndakomeye, numva ngize imbaraga ntasangamo. Tugiye he rero? Ntaho. Nararebye sindasubira muri aya mashuri, ararangaye, harimo n'intebe baraza kuzitwara. Ndageze muri shapeli ntabwo nahashobora naho, gusa ndasimbuka se ikigo ngende hanze ntabwo nagishobora. Numva ijwi rirambwira ngo jya muri ziriya wese, tugende. Numva bamwe ngo tugende. Njya kuri za wese z'abanyeshuri n'utuntu tungana burya dutoya, ndeba ahantu handuye habi cyane umuntu atatinyuka kugira ajya akaruka, njyamo. Ntabwo nakinze urugi, naruhagaze nk'imbere nk'uko waba uhagaze hariya, urugi nduhagararamo imbere gutya, nta muntu wabonaga ko harimo umuntu. Hagararamo nijoro ndicara, nta muntu wageze, ariko numvaga bagenda basahura bagera gute, ariko ntibahagera. Ngo ni itariki 12, umunsi ukurikiyeho bigenda uko. Undi munsi ukurikiyeho numva hinjiyemo abantu basakuza, kumbi bashorewe na mbona mpeka n'abasirikare. Baravuga ndumva, bavuga ko bagomba kurundarunda iyo mirambo yose bakayitwika kugira ngo abazungu batazayibona. Mbona mpeka niwe watanze isansi yo gutwika, barabatwitse nkajya numva biraturagurika, batsikanuka.
When speaking about memory, we often leave out the opposite, which is to say forgetting. Everybody forgets. It is a natural and important process. And yet for the rescapés, there seems to be almost an injunction against doing so, as if forgetting is, as I mentioned before, an erasure of the past, tantamount to a second elimination a completion or fulfillment of the genocide. Here, Ansila speaks of her need to remember. Her need to remember, like her need to eat, is as essential as any other basic human need. In fact, because her 7 children no longer exist, when she dies, so too will her whole family legacy be eliminated. Her act of conveying family history, recorded through narrative in this testimony, is an act of survival itself. In some ways, her telling through testimony can be seen as an attempt to exist into the future. For whom is she leaving the testimony behind? To whom do we imagine she is speaking? Ansila's transmission of memory becomes the mechanism for her own survival, even if not corporeal. But tragically, what we witness in this excerpt is that Ansila's very essential need to remember is at odds with her failing mind, due to loss of memory, due to trauma, due to age. Because her body is trying to forget, Ansila must work against that in order to remember. And for this reason, as she explains, she wrote the names of all of her children who were killed so that she may never forget. I believe it's incumbent upon all of us in the international community to work against our own collective desire to forget, even as we intellectualize or discuss Rwanda today using language as if Rwanda itself is an idea and has become a success story. We too will be taking part in something akin to a forgetting a loss that will always remain much larger than anything that will ever be born out of the genocide. Listening to oral history of any kind has never been a passive act. In Rwanda's past, storytelling and oral history was an essential part of the passing along of proverbs and historical inheritance. Like in any oral tradition, it required a listener to receive the narratives and someday pass them along after having been passed through the next generation. Testimony is not dissimilar in that it requires someone to receive the narrative, and listening is not a passive act. Listening demands a response, internal or otherwise. In Josephine's testimony, we're reminded of how Clinton and the international community chose to ignore the overwhelming evidence. In Josephine's testimony, we learn how the evidence itself, the bodies, was erased through burning. Josephine's testimony becomes her proxy evidence, replacing this erasure, and therefore, in witnessing her testimony, we become charged with heeding the presence of the evidence. Josephine Murebwire is an eyewitness to the crimes of Bonamheka Stanislas. History, no matter how much evidence is erased, cannot change the fact that Bonamheka Stanislas remains a genocidaire of the highest order who planned, enacted, and eliminated the evidence of genocide. He remains at large, in spite of the case brought against him by Alain and Dafroze Gauthier in the French courts. It was the French who gave Bonamheka asylum for many years, protecting him and harboring him. In spite of the case filed in the French courts, the French have not launched any investigation, and it is suspected that they have allowed him to cross over the border now into Belgium. To allow this case to sit without investigation is to be complicit in the erasure of the trace, and it is an obstruction of international justice. And Bonamheka is one of the many, one of the dozens, one of the hundreds that remain at large. Today, many of us will be speaking about prevention and all of the international institutions and safeguards we are now building to prevent genocide. But it is a challenge to think about prevention and deterrence when speaking about our international judicial systems without recognizing that we are currently allowing impunity to persist. As recently as last year, the case of Beatrice Munyenyezi in New Hampshire was a reminder to us how our own nation is harboring those with the direct complicity to genocide. As Americans, this injustice becomes our collective responsibility. In addition to serving as evidence, testimony too becomes our window of understanding into so much of what is happening in Rwanda today. We can learn from journalists and politicians, but it is through narratives from those who choose to speak that we can understand what is happening on the ground in Rwanda and what are the questions we should be asking about this history. It is through narratives we come to understand one of the successes of Gacaca for the rescapés. That was the discovery of the bones of their relatives, because, of course, no amount of punitive justice could ever be enacted to bring back the dead. It is through narratives that we learn about the resistance of the rescapés under attack using stones and slingshots, and about the challenging ideas like cannibalism during the genocide, or prostitution among the rescapés after, or the complicated social dynamics in Rwanda today, and so much of what remains unexplored. At the end of this historical reckoning, perhaps, we will find what it is most important in these testimonies is not what is being told, but simply that the rescapés are telling and how they are telling. By listening more deeply to the what and the how and the that at the same time, all of that in these narratives, we can learn more about Rwanda and ourselves, more than by simply looking at our own institutional failures. Moreover, we will see our failures reflected in the world in a tangible way on the lives of others, and their memories will become our own, persistent in a way we will be forced to reckon with from one generation to another. I will now share a testimony from Vincent's testimony.
Umugore rero umudamu udasanzwe mama Mukamuseverena yamubyeyi mwiza cyane kudukesha byinshi mu buzima bwacu cyane njye gute cyanjye yarankundaga cyane mama wanjye cyane ariko nk'imfura ye yarampaye n'inka njye n'umwe abana tuvukana barogotse mwese murabizi ko nta n'umwe mama yahaye inka njye yaragiye gusa yarampaye inka dukundana cyane. Tugeze mu rugo tubona ibintu bibi cyane mu buzima bwawe nabonye kugeza uyu munsi n'ibindi bibi ndabona nka biriya. Tubona abantu mu rugo abantu bari aho ngaho babashyize ku murongo haruguru y'inzu yacu nini babatemaguye. Igihe bari abantu 7 harimo mama bashiki banjye 2 umuntu wanjye umwe n'abantu bari bavuye w'amasenye n'abana be 2 bari bavuye i Kigali Gishushu. Dusanga amaraso icyo bita umuvu w'amaraso gusa menshi pe kwivuga nk'umuntu turi inyamaswa ahubwo kwivuga biragoye no gukora amagambo nuko umuntu ashobora kuba yarabivuga rwabyo n'undi buhamya. Icyo twakoze twasanze ndaje mu yapfuye byarangiye ariko ubu umuntu wanjye ntabwo yaratarapfa gihorogoma ariko azi ko yapfuye n'abashiki banjye bari batari bapfa nabo ko bajya mu maraso ariko dukoze dusanga baranyeganyega n'abandi bantu bari bavuye i Kigali nabo bari bapfuye 2. Icyo twakoze n'umudeshe ndi uzavuga tubona dufite ubwoba twarabafashe tubashyira mu bitenge tubashyira mu rwanyasuri umunsi mu rugo tubashyira mu rwanyasuri ngeze bashobora kose kujya iwacu Tamperiska reka ngo ngende hari umuntu muto witagande mu nyandi mu banzi baduturanye abo tukaze nabo bari bahunze igihe uhanga hari habaye vide kabisa reka ngende muri iyo nzu uriya n'umuntu kaze inzu irafunguye nta muntu wakeka ko ari umuntu wishe mu nzu tundagenda njya mu nzu hari ikintu cyagifunguye zari zanzu zimwe zagituranye zidafite plafond hejuru ku gice hejuru mu kindi cyumba hari inka rero mu nzu ye niyo yampunze imisi 3. Iyo nka nari ifite yanza nari na gato cyane ngo urabona ko wenda ndamaze kuzunja gukera nari gato cyane wowe uri muto nari gato cyane muto pe noneho nana byagiye kumera nkajya fata ya nka nkamera mu kanwa kuba ntagikomera kubona inzara yose inka nayo ntabwo irisha yishwe n'inzara njye nkayifata nkashyira inyana yayo ironka iki se nkayivanaho nkayizirika barageza kwikaba umukara cyangwa kabaye n'uriho mutagatifu wamvugiyemo ati se ahantu uri ntabwo hafungwa uriya muryango wundi urafunze waciye hejuru wajya hafunze warabuze ko amanka yawe uzagizwe ajya gute ayikama gusura hariya kungo abantu baje guhiga bakuvumbura ariko hanga hafunze ntabwo bazi hano mubakurira ajya kureba hariya nikora mbikoze ndahawe umusashira umunsi akurikiyeho wa mugore wa gatatu wa mugore aragaruka azanye n'abantu bamuherekeje yarazanye ubanza n'umwe karimo baraza interahamwe zijya gushya zijya ahantu bati nkanyu barayibye uko nk'abayibye nabyumva ko bayibye umunsi mbere yuko umugore atahuka baraje bareshe baragenda inka byumva ayitwara ndavuga ngo ndapfuye inka yanjye nikabiraho kanwa iragiye nza mu bandi urugo rwakinye rwaraza baraza bajya mu cya cyumba bajya munsi y'urutara nyumva umuntu akazi gatoya angana murimo ngahangaha utufunguzo umuntu rufite wakatwa twagiye mu kazi guhumba wowe basi ndi munsi y'urutara rwawe aho baraza barafungura batangira guteka bajya gute ubuzima burashyuha ndibaza nzaga munsi y'urutara ndasohoka ryari tuguhe ibiryo bituma mushonje kudeba ibyo gikora mu gitanda cy'iwacu kigo cyawe ndakimenya ngo intebe z'iwacu si ibiryo byacu biti utwaze ko zabyibusha kuba turabikiye ubu se kuvuga byinshi nkabona ko neza nka wenda bangaburiza inyama nta handi nyine inka z'iwacu wenda bariye ariko sinabivuga kurya birahangana peti ariko nyine zabarinza nyine ndafungura nyine maze gufungura rero rero tuvira gusambu ugenda kuko nitukwishe tuvugaburire ko tuvira kuko amaraso yawe ashaka tubarwaho natwe ntabwo ushaka gupfa ngo dupfe kubera wowe noneho ubuye ko mama we naramwishyuye 1994 kuri 11 ariko bishobora tuzo mu Wednesday we naramwishyuye na tante n'umwana we batatu mbashya mu Yesu munsi wacu papa we n'ungu sinza aho yaguye n'umucyo kirambabaza ko ntazo papa yaguye ariko ugiye kuza n'abantu benshi barasika papa yaguye abagabo kenshi ntabwo tunya baguye kuko babarwana bagiye n'abantu benshi barasika muzaganira ababashyinguye base barabazi ikintu kishinga umutima nuko nabuze n'ifoto nagiye hanze gusa muri banki populaire ndayibura sanga bayivanyeho njya ku karere mbona ifishi gusa sanga kafoto bakanabayemo nshaka gushitana kuri radio mu ufite ifoto zamuha amafaranga no kubutewe nabo biranyobera ndetse n'abantu nawe narayuze ifoto hose nayo ifoto birabiraje mu mutima cyane icyo cyashimishije nuko koko banjye ufite abana yatumye akigera nk'itatu cyangwa ine yatumye akine kancarinze kukikabaje n'ibintu ako ngiye gutekereza nijoro ndyamye nsanga nibyo ntabwo abona mama abona papa ikibazo ntazi kugira ngo mvuke fata imodoka mishyira mu mazutu tugira uhanga iwacu buri butare tubanyi bari hehe iwacu barabishe none se ninde wabishe ni interahamwe none se interahamwe ni bantu ki umwana w'umwana nyine rero nawe byumva ni abantu nyine babibisha abantu bla 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 ako tubataha akujya ntekereza umwana wabyo binamajije tugize mu rugo mu gitondo hari ku cyumweru kwa mbere kwiga tutashye mugoroba kuko kazi navuye ku ishuri sekondari njya papa ndera abana nawe cyane sikubera iki abantu shaka abana mu wawe kweda
I wanted to end on that question of the intergenerational transmission of narrative, to leave us with that final thought. But maybe if there's a microphone, we have just a few minutes left for questions.
Thank you, Taylor. I think it was a good start to start this conference with this video. I think we can go deeply in. We can go back in 1994 and try to understand what happened in this country. Last week, last Thursday, I was invited to give a talk at the British High Commissioner in Kigali.
And Jean Damascene, maybe you could mention who you are and your role as well.
I'm Jean Damascene Gazanabo from Rwanda. Last Thursday, I was invited to give a talk at the British High Commissioner in Kigali. And Josephine Murebwayire was there. She gave a testimony. And what she said is exactly what you showed right now. And I want to add that this lady, she lost everybody, her husband, or her children. She's just alone. And Taylor didn't he didn't show what her testimony is, but when she is telling about what happened to her, really, it's too emotional and too hard, and you say, yeah, you feel that maybe you understand what was genocide really, because she lost everything. So I want to say this, and thank you, Taylor, for sharing with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm wondering if you could tell us just a little bit about the larger project and what you intend to do with these videos and that.
Thank you, Barbara. These excerpts are just that, very, very short excerpts. And from each of these testimonies that you've seen today, these testimonies sometimes are 10 hours long, 11 hours, 12 hours long. So what you're seeing is just a tiny little bit from each individual's universe of narrative. And these testimonies are part of a larger body of the Voices of Rwanda archive, which I've been working to build with a team, which will be, we started filming in 2006, and we intend to film even for another 15 years into the future to build an archive of these testimonies that will live both in Rwanda and the United States, that will be used in schools and museums and commemorations, and will exist for the future generations, both in Rwanda and outside, to go and watch these testimonies. We have many models for video testimony archives, and it's really from the Fortunat Video Archives for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale where I first encountered testimony and the essential nature of testimony and the power of it and what it demands of us as listeners to the testimony. And it's with those individuals who built that archive as my mentors that we began to work in Rwanda to do this, because in 2004 when I was first there and even later, no project existed that existed for the sole purpose of filming testimonies, and there was no space for the rescapés outside of commemoration activities and memorials to be able to share their testimonies. Yes, there were instances, for example, later we'll have a panel on Gacaca where individuals could come forth publicly to talk about what happened, but no space existed that was entirely for the individual to share in the way that we feel we're creating with this archival project. So right now, these testimonies are being used in various commemorations and museums. We have a running exhibit right now at the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, and we just launched an exhibit last week at UNESCO, and they will be used at the African Union Human Rights Memorial Museum in Addis Ababa, and later in September, there will be a museum, a permanent exhibition that will open up in South Africa about Rwanda at the Johannesburg Holocaust Center, and these testimonies will be part of that museum. So the hope is to bring these individuals and these voices around the world. So we will continue filming in Rwanda for many years, as I mentioned, and that's in a nutshell the project. But we have many different sort of side projects to that, which we can talk about at some other time, perhaps later in the day or even tomorrow.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to ask you about the process of doing the interviews. If you could talk about the questions, or because sometimes the testimony change depending on the questions that you ask. Thinking about more the collaboration between the journalist or the filmmaker and the person who's giving the testimony.
Thank you, Anna. As someone like Anna who has worked with testimonies, or rather testimonies within films and literature, I can sort of respond to this in talking about testimony as different from films. Myself, I have a background in documentary filmmaking, and in order to build this archive, one of the things I felt I had to learn, or rather unlearn, was the process of filmmaking, that I had to step aside as a filmmaker, as somebody who was crafting the narrative, in order to try to allow the individual to have their own testimony take shape. And so what started in a very different way, more like interviewing, has evolved methodologically to very open-ended process, where these testimonies, as I mentioned, can go on as long as a person wants to speak, and we never stop them. If they want to continue, we are there for that. And we don't have any list of questions. Certainly, we have sort of a way of beginning, which is talking about the past, long before the genocide ever began. And from that material, we have very, very rich and beautiful stories of childhood, like you saw with Vincent today, talking about as a child he was given a cow by his mother. And these are stories that, draw out both Rwandan culture and tradition, as well as on a personal level, meaning when we later come to understand that he feels he was fed his own cows. So in a sense, he was fed the cow by his neighbors that his mother gave him. Or later on, when he's milking the cow in order to survive, we understand that he had a very close relationship with cows in his childhood. And so we hear stories that I think sometimes help us understand more deeply what's actually happening when they're describing the ordeals that they are going through during the genocide. And most of the questions, per se, are really open-ended based on what people have responded. So if somebody talks about cows in childhood, well then, that might be a point of departure in order to discuss cows or his particular cow. And then he'll talk about maybe when he received the cow, or what his cow's name was, or how children take care of cows and wash cows, and how they have a proverb in Rwanda that says, "He who does not have a cow wets his bed." And we say, what does that mean? And Jean Damascene is laughing. Maybe he can explain what it means. But what I come to understand what it means, probably in a very narrow understanding, is that if you have cows, you have to go and check up on them at night. You go outside and make sure the cow's okay. And while you're out there, you relieve yourself. And so there are these little proverbs that say, okay, he who does not have a cow wets his bed. And so these are really rich cultural understandings that come out through this process. So it is not the act of crafting. Of course, you see these selections. And of course, those in themselves are choices. And of course, subtitling and translation from Kinyarwanda, already an incredibly rich language, very complicated language, to translate that into English. One must make choices. When Vincent talks about the people that were lying there. He calls them people. He doesn't call them bodies. But in order for us to understand that they're dead, we have to put in brackets bodies. So there are all these choices that we do make in order to try to draw out, and we hope that in the future, a confrontation with the archive itself, and the archivists will be working with this material to help embed the kind of understandings that we have to bring to these testimonies in order to more deeply understand them, whether linguistic, cultural, or otherwise.
Thanks, Taylor. I just had a quick question. I'm wondering how you go about finding people to give their testimonies and what the process looks like for people to, do they come to you? Do you seek them out? And who is able to give a testimony? Can it be rescuers, such as the person described in the video? Can it be, is it only survivors? What does that process look like?
Thanks, Marie. I'll start by saying that at the very beginning of the organization, it was a different process to what it is now. Now it is really through word of mouth that people come to us, and we can't fulfill the need because we don't yet have the resources to fulfill the need of everybody who wants to share. That said, sharing testimony is not for everybody. Many people cannot. Many people can't bring themselves to talk about these things that have happened, and so it is a self-selecting group. We certainly, if they're, I have filmed other individuals outside of the archive for different film projects who include rescuers, but certainly this archive would be open to that kind of material if they did come to share those testimonies. And of course, there are then questions that would have to be asked about rescuing and what that means, because there were people who, in the wake of the genocide, would pick up a young child, maybe so that they could say to the oncoming army, well, look, we saved this kid, we did nothing. And so there are always these kinds of questions, but it's really, right now, exists for the survivor community, the community of rescapés, who many of whom are belonging to organizations like Avega and ARGE, and it's through this sort of ground-up process that people have come to us, talking about their experience doing it.